What makes a country really powerful? Its army, its rulers, or the ideas that shape it? Prussia was once one of the most influential states in Europe. From a remote area in the east, a great power gradually developed that changed politics, war, and society permanently. Names such as Frederick II or Otto von Bismarck still stand for discipline, strategic thinking, and the unconditional will to power. But how could this rise succeed in the first place? Was it the military strength that made Prussia great, or was it the clever policy of its leadership? This is exactly the question we get to the bottom of in this video. Before we begin, it's up to you. Write what you think in the comments now. Military or political? What was more decisive for Prussia's success? And if you like such exciting insights into the story, then support the channel with a like and a subscription so that you don't miss a chapter of this journey. Now we are starting together into the fascinating history of Prussia. Chapter 1. The Origins, the Land of the Prussians. Before the name Prussia was associated with military discipline, tight administration, and great power, the area on the southeastern Baltic Sea coast was a harsh, largely undeveloped region. Dense forests, swampy lowlands, and numerous rivers shaped the landscape. For centuries, the so-called Prussians lived here, a Baltic people who were neither politically united nor culturally completely homogeneous, but nevertheless shared a common language and similar traditions. The Prussians belonged to the Baltic peoples, related to the Lithuanians and Latvians. Her life was strongly influenced by nature. They lived in small settlements, practiced agriculture, livestock breeding, and fishing. In particular, the amber found on the coasts of the Baltic Sea played an important role. This gold of the north was not only a valuable commodity, but also a symbol of cultural exchange between the Prussians and other regions of Europe. Politically, the Prussians were not centrally organized. Instead of a unified state, there were different tribes and clans, each with its own leaders. This structure made them independent and flexible on the one hand, but also vulnerable to external threats on the other. There was no strong central authority that could defend or unite the entire area. Religiously, the Prussians were deeply rooted in pagan beliefs. Their world was filled with nature spirits, gods, and holy places. Forests, rivers, and certain stones were considered sacred. Rituals and offerings played a central role in everyday life. Priests or spiritual leaders had great influence, as they were considered mediators between humans and the gods. This faith distinguished them greatly from their Christian neighbors to the west and south, which would later play a decisive role. The geographical location of the Prussians inevitably brought them into contact with other cultures. Merchants from Scandinavia, the Holy Roman Empire, and even more distant regions came to trade with them. Not only goods, but also ideas were exchanged. Nevertheless, the region remained culturally independent and resistant to external influences for a long time. But this isolation was not to last. From the early Middle Ages, Christian missionaries began to penetrate the area. Their goal was to convert the pagan Prussians to Christianity. However, these missionary attempts often met with resistance. For the Prussians, the adoption of Christianity meant not only a religious change, but also a profound change in their entire way of life and social order. Tensions between the Prussians and their Christian neighbors increased. The Kingdom of Poland in particular had an interest in expanding its influence to the north and Christianizing the region. But military advances often failed due to the difficult landscape and the fierce resistance of the local population. At the same time, the Prussian area was increasingly perceived in the eyes of Western Christianity as a pagan borderland, a space that was to be proselytized and controlled. This view eventually led to a development that would fundamentally change the fate of the region, the so-called Northern Crusades. While the Crusades were already known in the Holy Land, the Christian powers now turned their attention to Eastern Europe. The Prussians were not only seen as religious pagans, but also as an obstacle to political and economic expansion. The combination of missionary zeal and power political interests led to a new phase of confrontation. For the Prussians, this meant an increasing threat. Their loose tribal structure, which had long secured their independence, now became a disadvantage. Without a central leadership, It was difficult to defend oneself permanently against coordinated attacks from outside. Nevertheless, they put up fierce resistance for decades. Their fight was not only a military one, but also a cultural one. It was about preserving their identity, their religion, and their way of life. Every battle, every raid, and every defense was part of a larger struggle for the survival of a people. At the same time, the image of the region began to change. For the outside world, the land of the Prussians increasingly became a target, be it for missionaries, traders, or conquerors. The strategic location on the Baltic Sea made the area attractive, both economically and militarily. At the end of this phase, there was a turning point that was to have a lasting impact on the history of the country. The previous attempts to subjugate or proselytize the Prussians had not brought the desired success. Therefore, the Christian powers looked for new solutions, and found them in an organization that already had experience with religious wars. With the appearance of the Teutonic Order, a new chapter in the history of the region began. What had previously been a land of independent tribes was to change fundamentally in the coming decades. But before this development began, the land of the Prussians was a place full of contrasts, characterized by closeness to nature, spiritual depth, and a strong will for independence. It was a world that was soon to end, but whose traces still have an impact on the history of Europe today. This first chapter shows that Prussia did not simply come into being, but emerged from a complex prehistory. The roots go deep back to a time when the name Prussia did not yet exist, but the foundations for everything that was to follow had already been laid. Chapter 2: The Teutonic Order is coming. At the beginning of the 13th century, the land of the Prussians was at a turning point. The decades-long attempts by Christian rulers to proselytize the area and bring it under control had largely failed. Neither Polish dukes nor individual missionaries had managed to bring lasting peace to the region or to integrate it into the Christian world. Instead, many of these ventures had ended in bloody setbacks. It became increasingly clear to the Christian powers of Central Europe that a fundamental change of strategy was necessary. In this situation, an actor who already had experience with religiously motivated wars came onto the scene: the Teutonic Order. Originally founded in the context of the Crusades in the Holy Land, this order of knights was a militarily organized community whose goal was to defend and spread Christianity. The members were monks and warriors at the same time, bound by strict rules, discipline, and a clear religious mission. The opportunity for the order to become active in the East arose through an invitation from Poland. The Polish Duke was looking for a solution to the so-called Prussian problem. The constant attacks of the Prussians on Polish border areas, as well as the failed missionary attempts, had destabilized the region. In his distress, he turned to the Teutonic Order and offered it land and privileges if it should succeed in subjugating and Christianizing the Prussians. The order accepted this invitation, not least because the political situation in the Holy Land was deteriorating and new fields of activity were being sought. But unlike earlier missionaries, the Knights of the Order came not only with sermons, but above all with military organization, strategic thinking, and long-term plans. From the very beginning, their approach was systematic. They built fortified castles that served not only as military bases, but also as centers of administration and control. These castles were built and connected to each other at regular intervals, creating a network that allowed the order to secure the conquered territory step by step. However, the fight against the Prussians was anything but easy. The local population knew the terrain intimately and used the dense forests and swamps to their advantage. Again and again there were uprisings and guerrilla-like attacks, which caused considerable losses to the Knights of the Order. Nevertheless, the order prevailed in the long term, not least thanks to its better organization, its military equipment, and the continuous support from the West. A decisive factor for the success of the Teutonic Order was the so-called Crusade movement. Nobles and knights from different parts of Europe joined the campaigns in the East, lured by religious motives, but also by the prospect of fame, land, and fortune. This support provided the order with a steady reinforcement of its troops and made it possible to maintain the pressure on the Prussians for years. With each conquered region, the face of the country changed. The original culture of the Prussians was increasingly pushed back. Many were killed, expelled, or forcibly Christianized. At the same time, the order began to settle settlers from the West, mainly Germans, but also people from other regions of Europe. These settlers brought with them new agricultural methods, craft techniques, and a different social order. In this way, a completely new structure gradually emerged. An area of independent tribes became a strictly organized state of the order. Power no longer lay with local leaders, but with the leadership of the order. At the top was the Grand Master, who had both religious and political authority. Christianization played a central role in this. Churches were built, monasteries were founded, and missionaries were sent to spread the new faith. But this Christianization was often closely linked to violence. For many of the remaining Prussians, it meant not only a religious change, but also the loss of their cultural identity. At the same time, the state of the order developed into an economically important region. Trade across the Baltic Sea increased, cities were founded and expanded. Places such as Königsberg or Marienburg developed into important centers of trade and administration. The order knew how to act not only militarily, but also economically effectively. Malbork, one of the largest brick castles in Europe, became the symbol of this new order. It was not only a fortress, but also the administrative heart of the order state. From here, decisions were made, campaigns were planned, and the entire area was administered. But despite all its successes, the rule of the order did not remain undisputed. The violent subjugation of the Prussians, the strict order, and the concentration of power repeatedly led to tensions, both within the order and with neighboring powers. Poland and Lithuania in particular watched the order's expansion with growing concern. For the Prussians themselves, this time meant a profound upheaval. Their old way of life increasingly disappeared, their language and culture were pushed back. Within a few generations, an independent people became part of a new society shaped by the order. Nevertheless, the Prussians left traces that were not completely erased. Elements of their culture, place names, and traditions lived on, often hidden, but nevertheless present. The appearance of the Teutonic Order thus marks a decisive turning point in the history of the region. It was the moment when a largely undeveloped area became an organized state that was increasingly integrated into the political and economic structures of Europe. At the same time, this phase laid the foundation for everything that was to follow. The structures created by the order, administration, military, urban planning, formed the foundation for what would later become Prussia. Even though the order itself would later lose power, its influence remained noticeable for a long time. Chapter 2 thus shows not only the arrival of a new actor, but also the beginning of a profound change. It is the story of conquest, upheaval, and new beginnings, and of the emergence of an order that was to shape the region for centuries. Chapter 3: The Order State of Prussia. With the military subjugation of the Prussians and the gradual securing of the conquered territory, a new phase began for the Teutonic Order. A campaign became a state. The so-called Order State of Prussia did not come into being overnight, but developed into one of the best organized and at the same time most unusual political entities in Europe in the course of the 13th and 14th centuries. Unlike other states of its time, it was not a kingdom or duchy in the classical sense, but a spiritual knightly state, led by a religious elite that took on military and administrative tasks at the same time. At the center of this system was the Grand Master of the Teutonic Order. He was not only the supreme military commander, but also the political leader and a religious authority. His power was extensive, but it was embedded in a tight hierarchy. Under him stood the so-called Landmeister and Komtur, who were responsible for certain regions or castles. This structure enabled efficient administration and rapid implementation of decisions, a decisive advantage at a time when many other dominions were characterized by internal power struggles. The basis of the order state was a dense network of castles and fortified towns. These served not only for defense, but also as administrative centers. From here, taxes were collected, justice was administered, and military operations were coordinated. Particularly impressive was the system with which the order organized its territory. Each region was clearly mapped, each task defined, each decision part of a larger plan. An outstanding example of this organization was Marienburg, which became the main residence of the Grand Master. This massive complex was not only a fortress, but also the political heart of the order's state. This is where all the threads came together: administration, diplomacy, military, and religion. Malbork symbolized the power and aspiration of the order not only to rule, but to create a new order. In addition to military and political organization, economic development also played a central role. The order understood early on that a stable state could not be based on military strength alone. For this reason, he specifically promoted the settlement of farmers, craftsmen, and traders, especially from the Holy Roman Empire. This so-called Eastern settlement led to a profound change in the region. New villages and towns were built according to planned specifications. Fields were systematically developed, forests cleared, and trade routes expanded. The agricultural methods introduced significantly increased productivity. At the same time, brisk trade developed, especially via the Baltic Sea. The state of the order became part of the Hanseatic League's economic network, which gave it additional income and influence. The cities in the state of the order often received the so-called Kulturrecht, a form of city law that granted the inhabitants certain freedoms and self-governing rights. This made the cities attractive to settlers and encouraged their development into economic centers. Places such as Königsberg, Elbing, or Gdansk became increasingly important and became important hubs in trade between East and West. But as efficient and successful as the organization of the order state was, it had its price. The local population, the remaining Prussians, played only a subordinate role in this new order. Many of them had been pushed into the lowest social classes. Their language and culture were increasingly suppressed, their traditional structures dissolved. Christianization, which had officially been one of the main goals of the order, was now consistently implemented. Churches and monasteries sprang up throughout the country, and the Christian faith became the binding basis of social life. But here, too, the ambivalence of this development became apparent. While some accepted the new religious structures, for others it meant the loss of their identity. Everyday life in the state of the order was characterized by order, discipline, and clear rules. The Teutonic Order attached great importance to a functioning administration and a stable society. Law and order were strictly enforced, and violations could be severely punished. At the same time, however, this order also provided a certain security and stability, which was lacking in many other regions of Europe. Militarily, the state of the order remained an important power. Even after the Prussians were largely subjugated, the order continued to wage campaigns, especially against the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, which was also considered pagan. These wars served not only religious goals, but also to secure and expand their own sphere of influence. Over time, the order state developed into an integral part of European politics. Diplomatic relations with other rulers were cultivated, alliances were formed, and conflicts were resolved. The order had long been more than just a religious community. It was a state with its own interests and ambitions. But it is precisely this development that also brought new challenges. The tight, centralized structure, which had long been an advantage, could also prove inflexible. Decisions were often made by a small elite, with no regard for local specificities or needs. This repeatedly led to tensions, especially in the cities, which increasingly developed their own self-confidence. There were also conflicts within the order. Not all members agreed with the development from a religious order of knights to a state acting in power politics. The original ideals, poverty, obedience, and religious devotion, increasingly receded into the background, while power and influence gained in importance. At the same time, the pressure from outside grew. Poland and Lithuania, who had united in the meantime, became serious opponents. They viewed the order's expansion with suspicion and saw their own interests threatened. The tensions between these powers were to play a decisive role in the coming chapters. Despite these challenges, the state of the order reached its peak in the 14th century. He was economically strong, militarily powerful, and politically influential. Its cities flourished, its administration functioned efficiently, and its castles bore witness to its power. But cracks were already beginning to appear under the surface. The tensions within society, the conflicts with neighbors, and the changes within the order itself indicated that this period of prosperity would not last. Chapter 3 shows the state of the Order of Prussia in its full form, as a unique entity that combined religion, military, and politics. It is the story of a state that emerged from conquest and developed into one of the most formative forces of its time. At the same time, however, it is also the story of a system that threatened to fail because of its own contradictions. This chapter thus forms the climax of early Prussian history, and at the same time the starting point for the coming decline that will shape the next chapter. Chapter 4: The Decline of the Order. In the 14th century, the Teutonic Order had reached its peak. The state of the Order of Prussia was considered well organized, economically successful, and militarily powerful. His castles dominated the landscape, his cities flourished, and his political position in the Baltic Sea region was consolidated. But it was precisely in this phase of strength that developments began to emerge that were to lead to the decline of the order in the long term. What initially seemed like individual challenges developed over time into a profound crisis that shook the entire system. A central factor in this decline was the change in the political landscape in Eastern Europe. While the Teutonic Order had consolidated its power, its neighbors had not remained idle either. The unification of the Kingdom of Poland with the Grand Duchy of Lithuania was particularly decisive. This combination created a new great power that was able to seriously oppose the order, both militarily and politically. Lithuania, which had long been considered a pagan target of the wars of the order, had in the meantime been Christianized. With this, the Teutonic Order lost an important part of its ideological justification for further campaigns. The wars against Lithuania had played a central role in the order's politics for decades. They served not only religious goals, but also the legitimation of his existence. With the Christianization of Lithuania, this foundation began to falter. The order now had to justify to an increasingly critical European public why it continued to take military action against Christian neighbors. The tensions between the order and the Polish-Lithuanian Union eventually led to one of the most significant conflicts in the region, the Great War at the beginning of the 15th century. This war culminated in the famous Battle of Tannenberg in 1410, a turning point in the history of the order. In this battle, the Teutonic Order suffered a devastating defeat. A large part of his military leadership fell, and the myth of his invincibility was permanently shaken. Although the order did not collapse immediately, the defeat had far-reaching consequences. Militarily, he was weakened, under political pressure and financially heavily burdened. The costs of the war were enormous, and the revenues were no longer sufficient to maintain the existing structures. In order to pay off the debts incurred, the order was forced to increase taxes and introduce new taxes. These measures led to growing resentment within the population, especially in the cities. The merchants and craftsmen who had previously benefited from the economic upswing felt increasingly burdened and politically disadvantaged. They had hardly any say, but had to bear the financial burden. This developed into an opposition that openly questioned the authority of the order. An important expression of this resistance was the founding of the so-called Prussian League. This association of cities and nobles was directed against the rule of the Teutonic Order and sought support from the Polish king. Thus, an internal dissatisfaction turned into an open political conflict. The resulting war, which became known as the 13 Years' War, presented the order with an existential challenge. Unlike previous conflicts, this war was not only a fight against external enemies, but also an internal conflict in which parts of its own population had risen up against the rule of the order. The fronts were complex, and the order's resources were not sufficient to succeed both militarily and politically. The duration and intensity of this war increasingly exhausted the state of the order. Military defeats piled up, the financial situation continued to deteriorate, and political isolation increased. In the end, there was a decision that was to seal the end of the previous order, the Second Peace of Tarunia in 1466. This peace treaty meant a heavy blow for the Teutonic Order. It lost large parts of its territory, including important cities and economically important regions. The remaining state was also brought into a relationship of dependence with the Polish king. The Grand Master of the Order had to recognize the Polish ruler as a feudal lord, a symbolic and political turning point of enormous significance. With this treaty, the state of the Order lost not only its size and power, but also its independence. A once sovereign and dominant force had become a weakened vassal state. The authority of the Order was permanently damaged, and its future uncertain. But the Order's problems were not limited to external conflicts. Tensions also arose within the organization itself. The original ideals of the Order, religious devotion, community, and discipline, had increasingly receded into the background over time. Instead, power interests, political intrigues, and personal ambitions shaped the picture. Many members of the Order were dissatisfied with this development. Internal conflicts arose, which further limited the ability to act. At the same time, it became increasingly difficult to recruit new members, as the Order had lost its reputation. What was once considered an honorable task now seemed to many to be a risky and unattractive undertaking. The economic basis of the Order was also shaken. The loss of important trading centers and the ongoing costs of the war led to a financial crisis. The Order increasingly had to take out loans and became dependent on donors. This further weakened his position and made him vulnerable to external pressure. The cities, which had once been the engine of the economic upswing, increasingly developed a life of their own. They demanded more rights, more co-determination, and greater consideration of their interests. The conflict between central authority and local self-determination became another problem area that the Order could not solve. All these factors, military defeats, political isolation, economic difficulties, and internal conflicts, led to the Order state increasingly losing stability in the course of the 15th century. What had once been a strong, well-organized system began to falter. Nevertheless, the Order lasted for some time. Its structures were deeply rooted, and its history continued to give it some legitimacy. But it was clear that a fundamental change was necessary to survive. This change would eventually take place in the next chapter, when the last Grand Master of the Order made a decision that marked the end of the Order state in its previous form and at the same time marked the beginning of a new political entity. Chapter 4 thus shows the slow but inevitable decline of the Teutonic Order in Prussia. It is the story of a system that collapses due to external challenges and internal contradictions, and clears the way for a new epoch in Prussia's history. Chapter 5: The Duchy of Prussia emerges. The decline of the Teutonic Order in the 15th century had triggered a development that could no longer be stopped. The once powerful rule of the Order was politically weakened, economically ailing, and internally torn. After the Second Peace of Tarunia, the Order was only a shadow of its former self, dependent on the Polish king and without the former authority. But out of this crisis a new order was to develop, an order that would form the foundation for what would later become Prussia. At the center of this change was a single personality, Albrecht of Brandenburg-Ansbach. As the last Grand Master of the Teutonic Order in Prussia, he was confronted with an almost hopeless situation. The order was politically isolated, militarily weakened, and financially exhausted. At the same time, pressure from outside grew, especially from Poland, which was asserting its feudal sovereignty more and more clearly. Albrecht realized that simply sticking to the old structures was no longer a solution. The order as it had existed until then was no longer viable. But instead of simply accepting the downfall, he looked for a radical way out. This way out was to change not only the political order, but also the religious basis of the state. At that time, a movement was spreading in Europe that fundamentally questioned religious and social structures, the Reformation. The ideas of Martin Luther found increasing supporters and questioned the authority of the Catholic Church. Albrecht also came into contact with these ideas, and they had a significant influence on his thinking. In close association with Luther, Albrecht developed a plan that was as bold as it was consequential: the secularization of the religious state. This meant that the ecclesiastical territory of the Teutonic Order was to be transformed into a secular duchy. The religious rule of the Knights of the Order would end, and a dynastic secular government would take its place. This step was revolutionary. It meant not only the end of the state of the order, but also a break with centuries-old traditions. But in view of the existing crisis, it seemed to be the only way to stabilize the region politically and secure its future. In 1525, this plan became reality. In a solemn act, Albrecht took off the habit of the order, professed Protestantism, and transformed the remaining territory of the order into the Duchy of Prussia. At the same time, he recognized the Polish king as his feudal lord and received confirmation of his new position as secular duke in return. This act, which became known as the Prussian homage, marked a historic turning point. A clerical knightly state had become a secular duchy, the first Protestant state in Europe. This marked the beginning of a new chapter in the history of Prussia. The transformation brought about profound changes. The previous structure of the order was dissolved and a new administration was established. Knights of the order were now replaced by secular officials who conducted the affairs of government. Power was concentrated in the hands of the duke, who now acted as the central ruler. The religious order was also fundamentally changed. Protestantism became the official denomination of the duchy. Churches were redesigned, monasteries dissolved, and ecclesiastical properties secularized. This led not only to a new religious practice, but also to a redistribution of power and property. For the population, these changes meant both opportunities and challenges. On the one hand, the new order opened up opportunities for social advancement and economic development. On the other hand, it brought uncertainty and pressure to adapt, especially for those who had been strongly associated with the old structures. The cities played an important role in this phase. They had already gained influence before and now became important partners of the new ducal government. Trade and crafts continued to develop, and the duchy benefited from its location on the Baltic Sea. At the same time, the political situation remained complex. As a fief of Poland, the Duchy of Prussia was not formally independent. The Duke was beholden to the Polish king, which limited the possibilities for foreign policy action. Nevertheless, Albrecht and his successors managed to maintain a certain independence within this framework. Another important aspect of this time was the connection to Brandenburg. Albrecht came from the House of Hohenzollern, a dynasty that already ruled in Brandenburg. This family connection would later play a decisive role when Brandenburg and Prussia were more closely linked. Internally, Albrecht sought reforms that were intended to stabilize the duchy. Education was promoted, administration was modernized, and the economy was strengthened. Universities and schools emerged, and the ideas of the Reformation increasingly shaped intellectual life. But despite all the progress, the Duchy of Prussia remained a fragile entity. Dependence on Poland, religious tensions, and economic challenges repeatedly put the young order to the test. It was a state in transition, shaped by the past, but at the same time on the way to a new future. The significance of this chapter lies above all in the fundamental transformation that is taking place here. The transition from an order state to a duchy marked not only a political change, but also a cultural and religious upheaval. It was the moment when Prussia began to develop as an independent political entity. At the same time, this phase shows how closely the history of Prussia is linked to the great developments in Europe. The Reformation, the power politics between Poland and the German territories, and the changes in society and the economy, all these factors interacted and formed the new duchy. The end result is a state that has broken away from its medieval roots and is ready for the challenges of modern times. But the actual development of Prussia is still to come. The connection with Brandenburg, the further strengthening of the Hohenzollerns, and the rise to a great power, all this is still in the future. Chapter 5 thus forms the transition between two epochs, the medieval state of the order and the early modern duchy. It is the story of a new beginning, born out of the crisis, marked by courageous decisions and full of possibilities for what was to come. Chapter 6. Under Polish feudal sovereignty. With the transformation of the state of the order into the Duchy of Prussia in 1525, a new era began, but it was marked by tension from the very beginning. Although the duchy developed an independent political structure under the leadership of Albrecht of Brandenburg-Ansbach, it formally remained a fief of the Polish king. This dependence determined the political reality of Prussia for several generations and influenced both its internal development and its foreign policy position. The so-called feudal sovereignty meant that the Duke of Prussia had to swear allegiance to the Polish king. This act was not only symbolic, but had concrete political consequences. The Duke was obliged to take into account Poland's interests, especially in matters of foreign policy. At the same time, he received protection and confirmation of his rule in return. This relationship was typical of the feudal order of the time, but in the case of Prussia it was particularly sensitive, as the duchy was geographically separated from the rest of Poland and culturally closely linked to the German territories. For Albrecht, this situation meant a constant balancing act. On the one hand, he had to secure the goodwill of the Polish king in order to stabilize his position. On the other hand, he wanted to preserve and expand the independence of his duchy. This tension characterized his entire reign. Domestically, Albrecht concentrated on building a functioning state. Secularization had dissolved the previous structures of the order, and it was now necessary to establish a new administration. Civil servants were appointed, laws were enacted, and institutions were created that formed the foundations of an early modern state. In doing so, they were partly based on models from the Holy Roman Empire, but adapted them to the specific conditions of Prussia. A central component of this inner development was the consolidation of Protestantism. The Reformation had not only changed the religious order, but also redefined the relationship between state and church. In Prussia, the Duke became the supreme canon of the church, which gave him additional authority. Church structures were reorganized, and the new denomination increasingly shaped social life. The introduction of Protestantism also had an impact on education and culture. Schools were founded, the Bible was distributed in German, and a stronger focus on education and individual responsibility for faith was promoted. This helped to create a new spiritual foundation for the duchy. Economically, Prussia continued to be strongly influenced by agriculture. Large parts of the population lived in the countryside and worked in agriculture. The nobility, especially the so-called Junkers, played a central role in this. They owned large estates and had considerable influence on local administration and economic development. Cities, on the other hand, developed more slowly than in other regions of Europe. Although trade continued, especially via the Baltic Sea, economic momentum remained limited. This was partly due to its geographical location, but also due to its political dependence on Poland, which limited its room for maneuver. After Albrecht's death in 1568, his son took over the rule. But the following decades were marked by uncertainty. The dynastic line was not stable, and there were phases of political weakness. During these times, the dependence on Poland became particularly clear, as the Polish king exerted influence on the succession and internal affairs of the duchy. At the same time, other actors gained in importance, especially the House of Hohenzollern in Brandenburg. This connection was to prove decisive. When the Prussian line of the Hohenzollerns died out, the duchy finally fell to the Brandenburg line. This created a personal union between Brandenburg and Prussia, a union that was to form the basis for the later rise to great power. But at that time, Prussia was still far from being an independent power. Poland's feudal sovereignty remained, and the political room for maneuver was limited. Nevertheless, a new self-image slowly began to develop. The connection with Brandenburg brought new impulses, new resources, and a stronger involvement in the politics of the Holy Roman Empire. Another important aspect of this period was the increasing militarization. Although Prussia was not yet a military state in the later sense, the importance of a powerful army began to be recognized. The experience of the past decades had shown how important military strength was for securing political interests. At the same time, relations with Poland remained ambivalent. It was characterized by dependence, but also by cooperation. In some phases, the relationship was stable and mutually beneficial. In others, it was characterized by mistrust and tension. This dynamic made the political situation in Prussia complex and often difficult to predict. The duchy was also in a transitional phase culturally. The influences from the German area, the traditions of the old Prussian population, and the political connection to Poland created a diverse but also contradictory identity. This mixture was to shape the development of Prussia in the long term. In the course of the 16th and early 17th centuries, it became increasingly clear that the future of Prussia did not lie solely in its relationship with Poland. The connection with Brandenburg, the changes in Europe, and the increasing importance of centralized states indicated that the political balance of power would shift. Chapter 6 shows Prussia in a phase of adaptation and reorientation. It is not a rise in the classical sense, but a time of transition in which the foundations for later developments are laid. Dependence on Poland limits opportunities, but at the same time new structures, new connections, and new perspectives are emerging. At the end of this phase there is a duchy that is not yet independent, but has already created the conditions for a future gain of power. The political experience, the institutional structures, and the dynastic connections form the foundation for the next chapter, in which Brandenburg and Prussia finally come together and a new state emerges. Chapter 6 thus becomes an important link in the history of Prussia. It connects the new beginning of the duchy with the coming rise and shows how strength can gradually emerge from dependence. Chapter 7: Brandenburg and Prussia united. In the course of the 17th century, Prussia entered a new phase of its development, a phase that was to become decisive for its later rise to great power. The unification of Brandenburg and Prussia was not a sudden event, but the result of a dynastic development that was deeply rooted in the political structures of Europe. It brought together two different territories: the Electorate of Brandenburg, which was located in the Holy Roman Empire, and the Duchy of Prussia, which was outside the empire and remained under Polish feudal sovereignty. This connection was created by the House of Hohenzollern, a dynasty that had ruled Brandenburg since the 15th century. When the Prussian line of the family died out, the Duchy of Prussia fell to the Elector of Brandenburg in 1618. This created a so-called personal union. Two politically separate territories were ruled by a single ruler. This new constellation was complex from the start. Brandenburg and Prussia differed in many respects: geographically, politically, economically, and culturally. Brandenburg was part of the Holy Roman Empire and integrated into its structures, while Prussia was formally a fief of Poland and lay outside the empire. This dual affiliation posed great challenges for the rulers. The first elector to rule both territories in personal union was Johann Sigismund. His reign was marked by uncertainty and external conflicts, especially by the beginning of the 30 Years' War in 1618. This war devastated large parts of Europe and also hit Brandenburg hard. Cities were destroyed, the population decimated, and the economic basis shaken. Prussia, on the other hand, was initially spared the worst effects of the war, as it was outside the immediate action of the war. This led to an uneven development within the personal union. While Brandenburg suffered from the consequences of the war, Prussia offered comparatively stable conditions. This situation made it clear how difficult it was to effectively govern two such different territories. There was no single administration, no common policy, and no central identity. Rather, it was a loose connection that was held together above all by the person of the ruler. A decisive turning point came with the reign of Frederick William, who became known as the Great Elector. He took office at a time when Brandenburg Prussia was politically weakened and economically bled dry. But Frederick William recognized the opportunities that lay in the connection of the two territories and began to make targeted use of them. His goal was to form a more integrated state out of the loose personal union. To this end, he relied on a series of reforms that affected both the administration and the military. He built a central bureaucracy that allowed him to implement decisions more efficiently and strengthen control over his territories. Particularly important was the construction of a standing army. At a time when many states were still dependent on mercenary troops, Frederick William recognized the importance of having its own, permanently available army. This army was used not only for defense, but also as an instrument to achieve its political goals. Another focus of his policy was the economic recovery. After the devastation of the 30 Years' War, it was necessary to rebuild agriculture, promote trade, and open up new sources of income. Friedrich Wilhelm specifically supported the settlement of refugees and skilled workers, especially Huguenots from France, who brought valuable knowledge and new impulses with them. The Great Elector also pursued a pragmatic line in foreign policy. He changed alliances when it served his interests and cleverly exploited the political tensions in Europe. A decisive success was the achievement of full sovereignty over the Duchy of Prussia. In 1657, he succeeded in shaking off Polish feudal sovereignty and turning Prussia into an independent possession. This step was of enormous importance. It meant that the ruler of Brandenburg Prussia was no longer dependent on another king, but could sovereignly dispose of his territory. At the same time, this opened up new opportunities for political and military development. The unification of Brandenburg and Prussia increasingly developed into a functioning state structure under Frederick William. Although the differences between the two regions remained, the central administration, the standing army, and the common foreign policy created a new form of unity. Nevertheless, this state was still far from a modern nation. There was no uniform language, no common identity, and no clear borders in today's sense. Rather, it was a so-called composite state that consisted of different parts, each retaining its own traditions and structures. The challenge was to organize this diversity while ensuring stable rule. Frederick William achieved this through a combination of military strength, administrative efficiency, and political skill. In doing so, he laid the foundation for what would later become known as the Prussian state. Another important aspect of this development was the role of the nobility. The so-called Junkers played a central role in the administration and the military. In return for their support, the elector granted them far-reaching privileges, especially in rural areas. This connection between the state and the nobility was to shape Prussian society for a long time to come. The geographical location also played an important role. Brandenburg and Prussia were not contiguous, but were separated by foreign territory. This made administration more difficult and made strong central leadership all the more important. At the same time, it forced rulers to act flexibly and secure their power through organization rather than territorial unity. At the end of the 17th century, the original personal union had given rise to a state which, although not yet one of the great powers of Europe, already had the necessary structures to take this path. The foundations were laid: a central administration, a standing army, economic approaches, and above all, political independence. Chapter 7 thus shows the decisive transition from a dependent duchy and a weakened electorate to an aspiring state with growing influence. It is the story of a union that not only brought two territories together, but also created the conditions for the later rise of Prussia. With this development, the stage is set for the next chapter, in which the electorate of Brandenburg Prussia becomes a kingdom and the rise to European great power finally begins. Chapter 8: The Great Elector. When Frederick William took over the rule of Brandenburg Prussia in 1640, he found a state that could hardly be described as a functioning state. The 30 Years' War had left deep wounds, cities lay in ruins, entire regions were depopulated, the economy had collapsed, and the political order had become fragile. This situation marked the beginning of the reign of a man who would later go down in history as the Great Elector, not because he inherited an empire, but because he formed a state out of chaos and weakness. Frederick William recognized early on that the previous structures were not sufficient to meet the challenges of his time. The loose connection between Brandenburg and Prussia, the different legal systems, and the lack of central control made an effective government almost impossible. His goal was therefore clear. He wanted to create a strong, capable state that could act independently and assert itself against external threats. The first step on this path was the establishment of a functioning administration. Frederick William began to limit the power of the estates, i.e. the nobility and the cities, and instead established a central bureaucracy. Officials were appointed who were directly subordinate to the elector and implemented his instructions. This development was a decisive step towards a modern state in which decisions were no longer made only locally, but centrally. But administration alone was not enough. In a time of constant conflict, Military strength was an indispensable instrument of political power. Frederick William therefore set out to build up a standing army, an innovation that was unusual for many contemporaries. Instead of relying on mercenaries, he created an army that existed permanently, was regularly trained, and was directly under his control. This army was not only a means of defense, but also an instrument for the implementation of his domestic political goals. It enabled the elector to break resistance, prevent uprisings, and secure his authority throughout the country. At the same time, it became a symbol of the new strength of Brandenburg Prussia. Another focus of his policy was economic reconstruction. After the devastation of the war, it was necessary to lay the foundations for prosperity and stability anew. Frederick William relied on an active economic policy. He promoted the reconstruction of agriculture, supported the crafts, and tried to stimulate trade. His openness to immigration was particularly remarkable. He realized that a new workforce and expertise were critical to rebuilding. A well-known example is the admission of Huguenots, French Protestants who had to leave their homeland due to religious persecution. They brought not only new skills, but also new ideas that contributed to economic and cultural development. The infrastructure has also been improved. Roads and waterways were expanded to facilitate trade and better connect the different parts of the state. This was particularly important because Brandenburg and Prussia were geographically separated and efficient communication was crucial for governance. In foreign policy, Frederick William showed himself to be a pragmatic and skillful diplomat. He was not interested in rigid alliances, but consistently pursued the interests of his state. At a time when Europe was characterized by changing alliances, he managed to act flexibly and take advantage of complex situations. A particularly significant success was the final solution of the question of Polish feudal sovereignty over Prussia. Through skillful negotiations and military pressure, Frederick William achieved that he no longer had to be considered a vassal of the Polish king. Prussia thus became a sovereign territory, and Brandenburg Prussia gained international prestige. But this path was not free of resistance. The estates, especially the nobility, saw their traditional rights threatened and in some cases put up fierce resistance to the elector's reforms. Frederick William met this resistance with determination, but also with tactical skill. He compromised where necessary, but ultimately prevailed and thus strengthened his position. A central element of his rule was the combination of the military and the administration. The army was not only used for defense, but was closely linked to the state organization. This connection laid the foundation for what would later be considered typically Prussian, a state in which discipline, efficiency, and military order played a central role. At the same time, a new understanding of the state developed under Frederick William. The state was no longer just a personal possession of the ruler, but a complex entity that had to be organized, administered, and further developed. This view was an important step towards modern statehood. Despite all its successes, however, Brandenburg Prussia remained a state in the process of being built. The economic situation was still fragile, the social structures were changing, and the international position was not yet consolidated. But the foundations that Frederick William laid were to prove decisive for further development. His death in 1688 marked the end of an era, but not the end of its impact. The structures he had created continued to exist and were further expanded by his successors. His son in particular was to build on this foundation and take another decisive step, the elevation of Brandenburg Prussia to a kingdom. Chapter 8 thus shows the phase in which a fragmented, weakened entity became a functioning state. It is the story of a ruler who recognized the signs of the times and was willing to make fundamental changes. Frederick William was not a conqueror in the classical sense, but a designer, someone who created the conditions for the rise of Prussia through organization, reforms, and political wisdom. Without the Great Elector, the later history of Prussia would hardly be conceivable. His reforms, his decisions, and his understanding of statehood laid the foundation for everything that was to follow. In this sense, Chapter 8 is not just the story of a single ruler, but the story of a new beginning, a state that was ready to assert its place in Europe. Chapter 9, Kingdom of Prussia is born, 1701. By the end of the 17th century, Brandenburg Prussia had developed from a fragmented and weakened territory into an increasingly consolidated state. The reforms of the Great Elector had created a stable foundation, a functioning administration, a standing army, and a growing political importance in the European power structure. But despite this progress, a decisive difference to the great powers of Europe remained. Brandenburg Prussia was not a kingdom. His ruler bore the title of Elector, and thus his position was formally below that of kings. For the successor of the Great Elector Frederick I, this was precisely a problem. He was ambitious, representational, and determined to elevate his state. At a time when title and rank played a central role in diplomacy, the royal dignity meant not only prestige but also political upgrading. Frederick wanted to put Brandenburg Prussia on a par with the great European monarchies, and for this a royal title was indispensable. But the path to get there was complicated. Within the Holy Roman Empire, it was not easily possible to elevate oneself to kingship. The title king was closely linked to the structure of the empire, and only a few rulers were allowed to bear it. Frederick therefore had to find a way to achieve the kingship without violating the existing political rules. The solution lay in a special circumstance: the Duchy of Prussia. This area was outside the Holy Roman Empire and had been sovereign since the time of the Great Elector. This is exactly where Friedrich came in. If he had himself crowned king, it was not as King of Brandenburg, but as King of Prussia, a subtle but decisive difference that enabled him to claim the kingship without directly challenging the order of the empire. In order to implement this plan, however, Frederick needed the approval of the emperor. He received this in the context of European power politics. The emperor was dependent on the support of Brandenburg Prussia in the upcoming conflicts, especially in the War of the Spanish Succession. Frederick skillfully exploited this situation and negotiated the recognition of his royal title. On January 18, 1701, the time had finally come. In Königsberg, Frederick was solemnly crowned king. This act was not only a personal triumph, but a historic moment for the entire state. Brandenburg Prussia had become the Kingdom of Prussia. The coronation was of great symbolic importance. It marked the transition from an electorate to a kingdom and gave the state a new identity. At the same time, it was an expression of the growing self-confidence of the Hohenzollerns, who were now no longer just regional rulers, but part of the European monarchy. But with the new title came new challenges. Frederick I attached great importance to representation and court culture. He built up a magnificent court, based on the great role models of Europe, especially France. Castles were expanded, festivals were celebrated, and a courtly culture was established that was intended to underline the claim of the new kingdom. However, this policy had its price. The elaborate courtship devoured enormous sums of money, and the financial burden on the state increased. While the external splendor increased, the economic basis remained limited. This led to tensions between the claim to greatness and the actual possibilities of the state. Nevertheless, the elevation to the status of a kingdom had long-term effects. It strengthened Prussia's position in European politics and opened up new diplomatic opportunities. As king, Frederick was able to negotiate on an equal footing with other monarchs, form alliances, and represent his interests more confidently. The new position also had an effect on the interior. The royal dignity helped to bring the different parts of the state closer together. Brandenburg and Prussia, which had long been only loosely connected, gradually developed a common political consciousness. The king became the symbol of this unity. At the same time, the structure of the state remained complex. The different territories had different traditions, rights, and administrative structures. There was no uniform legislation and no common identity in the modern sense. But the kingship created a framework in which these differences could gradually be overcome. Another important aspect was the role of the military. Even though Frederick I himself was not considered a great general, the army remained a central part of the state. It was not only an instrument of defense, but also a symbol of the strength and claim of the kingdom. The foundations laid by the Great Elector were continued and expanded. The coronation of 1701 can therefore be seen as a decisive step on Prussia's path to becoming a great power. It changed not only the title of the ruler, but also the perception of the state, both internally and externally. Prussia was no longer just an aspiring territory, but a kingdom with its own ambitions. But this ascent was not yet complete. The real strength of Prussia was only to become apparent in the coming decades, especially under the successors of Frederick I. One of them, Frederick II, was to make the kingdom one of the leading powers in Europe and inseparably link his name with the term Prussia. Chapter 9 thus shows the moment when Prussia redefines its place in the European order. It is the story of a political rise that was achieved not through conquest, but through skillful diplomacy and symbolic staging. The birth of the kingdom marked the beginning of a new era, an era in which Prussia began not only to experience history, but to actively shape it. Chapter 10: Frederick the Great. The accession of Frederick II to power in 1740 marked the beginning of one of the most formative epochs in the history of Prussia. Hardly any other ruler has had such a lasting influence on the image of this state as he has. Frederick II, later known as Frederick the Great, embodied a mixture of military genius, enlightened thinker, and uncompromising power politician. Under his leadership, Prussia finally rose to the circle of the European great powers, a rise that was not without conflicts, contradictions, and sacrifices. When Frederick ascended the throne, Prussia was already a well-organized state with a powerful army and a functioning administration. These foundations had been laid above all by his father, the Soldier King, who had consistently expanded the military and the state organization. So Frederick did not inherit a weak empire, but a solid foundation, and he was determined to expand it further and make Prussia a leading power in Europe. Even at the beginning of his reign, it became clear that Frederick was willing to take risks. Only a few months after his accession to the throne, he took advantage of the political uncertainty in the Habsburg Empire to attack Silesia, a prosperous and strategically important region. This step marked the beginning of the Silesian Wars and represented a clear departure from a purely defensive policy. The success of this undertaking was decisive for the further course of his rule. Despite considerable resistance, Frederick succeeded in conquering and holding Silesia. Prussia thus gained not only an economically important area, but also international prestige. At the same time, however, he made powerful enemies, especially the House of Habsburg, which did not want to accept the loss of Silesia. The following years were marked by military conflicts that took Prussia to the limits of its resilience. The 7 Years' War, which lasted from 1756 to 1763, posed an existential threat. Prussia faced a coalition of several great powers, including Austria, France, and Russia. In this seemingly hopeless situation, Frederick's military talent was particularly evident. Through skillful maneuvers, quick decisions, and consistent use of his resources, he succeeded in ensuring the survival of his state. Battles such as those at Rossbach or Leuthen went down in military history and consolidated his reputation as an extraordinary general. Nevertheless, the price was high, the country was devastated, the population suffered, and economic resources were heavily strained. At the end of the war, Prussia was able to maintain its position and keep Silesia. This success finally made Frederick a central figure in European politics. Prussia was no longer just an aspiring state, but a recognized great power. But Frederick was not only a soldier. He also saw himself as an enlightened ruler who wanted to integrate the ideas of the Enlightenment into his politics. He cultivated exchanges with philosophers, promoted science and art, and saw himself as the first servant of the state. This term was an expression of a new understanding of rule, in which the king not only ruled over the country, but also took responsibility for its well-being. In domestic policy, Friedrich relied on reforms that were intended to make the state more efficient and modern. The administration has been further expanded and professionalized. The judiciary has been reformed and the education system has been strengthened. He instituted measures that promoted religious tolerance and allowed various religious communities to live and work in his empire. Frederick also pursued an active economic policy. He had swamps drained, promoted agriculture, and supported the settlement of new inhabitants in sparsely populated areas. The aim was to increase productivity and secure the economic basis of the state. At the same time, he promoted manufactories and tried to reduce dependence on imports. Despite these reforms, Prussia remained a strongly hierarchical state. The nobility, especially the Junkers, retained their privileged position, especially in the military and administration. The peasants, on the other hand, had limited rights and were often tied to the land. Although Frederick was a representative of the Enlightenment, his reforms had clear limits. They served primarily to strengthen the state, not necessarily individual freedom. This contradiction is a central feature of his rule. On the one hand, he promoted education, tolerance, and economic development. On the other hand, he waged wars and adhered to traditional power structures. Frederick was not an idealistic reformer, but a pragmatic ruler who used the ideas of the Enlightenment where they served his goals. He also left clear cultural traces. His court in Potsdam, especially Sanssouci Palace, became a center of intellectual life. Artists, musicians, and thinkers met here, and Friedrich himself was an enthusiastic musician and writer. This cultural flowering helped to shape the image of Prussia as an enlightened state. Frederick remained active in foreign policy until the end of his reign. He took part in the first partition of Poland and was thus able to further expand the territory of Prussia. This expansion strengthened the strategic position of the state and connected previously separate territories. When Frederick died in 1786, he left behind a fundamentally changed Prussia. A medium-sized state had become a great power that was taken seriously in Europe. The administration was efficient, the military strong, and the economy stabilized. At the same time, he had created a system that was strongly tailored to his person, a system that depended on the authority and abilities of the ruler. Chapter 10 thus shows the decisive phase in which Prussia took its place among the leading powers of Europe. It is the story of a ruler who shaped the state through war, reforms, and personal commitment like no other. Frederick the Great remains an ambivalent figure, admired for his achievements, critically considered for his methods. But it is undisputed that his time in office represents a turning point. It marks the moment when Prussia finally becomes a force that actively shapes European history, and whose influence reaches far beyond its borders. Chapter 11: Prussia and the Napoleonic Wars. When Frederick II died in 1786, he left behind a strong political system that was also strongly tailored to his person. Prussia had risen to become a great power, but many of its structures had become rigid. The military successes had strengthened self-confidence, but also created a certain complacency. This was to prove dangerous in the coming decades, especially at a time when Europe was undergoing fundamental change. The French Revolution of 1789 called the existing order into question. Monarchies came under pressure, old privileges were challenged, and new ideas of freedom, equality, and popular sovereignty spread rapidly. For Prussia, which was based on a strong monarchical and military tradition, these developments were initially both a threat and a challenge. Initially, Prussia took part in the coalition wars against revolutionary France together with other European powers. But these early conflicts were not decisive, and Prussia temporarily withdrew from the direct conflict. Meanwhile, France continued to change, and with the rise of one man, a new phase began: Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon was not only a military genius, but also a political designer who reorganized the balance of power in Europe. His armies were modernly organized, fast and flexible, quite different from the often cumbersome armies of the old monarchies. Prussia, on the other hand, held on to its traditional structures for a long time and underestimated the new threat. This miscalculation was to prove fatal in 1806. In the battles of Jena and Auerstedt, the Prussian army suffered a crushing defeat. Within a few weeks, the military system that had once been considered a model in Europe collapsed. Cities were occupied, the government had to flee, and the state was on the verge of collapse. The defeat was a shock not only militarily, but also psychologically. Prussia's self-image as a strong, disciplined power was shaken. The weaknesses of the system, outdated structures, lack of flexibility and too much dependence on traditions, were relentlessly exposed. In the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807, Prussia had to accept difficult conditions. It lost about half of its territory, had to pay high reparations, and came under the influence of Napoleon. The state was politically humiliated and economically heavily burdened. But it was precisely in this crisis that a phase of far-reaching reforms began. The defeat became the starting point for a comprehensive change that was to strengthen Prussia in the long term. A group of reformers recognized that a fundamental restructuring was necessary to modernize the state and secure its future. Among the most important figures of this reform movement were Heinrich Friedrich Karl von Zumstein and Karl August von Hardenberg. They campaigned for a restructuring of the administration, society, and the military. A central component of these reforms was the abolition of serfdom. Farmers were given more personal freedom and were able to own land, which led to greater economic development in the long run. At the same time, the cities were strengthened by new regulations that enabled them to have more self-government. The administration has also been modernized. A rigid system was replaced by a more flexible, efficient structure that could better respond to the demands of the time. Civil servants were selected on merit, and the state organization was made clearer and more transparent. The reform of the military was particularly important. The Prussian army was fundamentally rebuilt. General conscription was introduced, training was improved, and leadership was modernized. The aim was to create an army based not only on discipline, but also on motivation and personal responsibility. These changes also had a social dimension. The state began to involve its citizens more and give them more responsibility. The relationship between state and society changed, away from a purely hierarchical order to more active participation. While Prussia was reforming, the political situation remained tense. Napoleon continued to dominate large parts of Europe, and Prussia was forced to follow his system. But over time, resistance to French domination grew. A decisive turning point came with Napoleon's Russian campaign in 1812, which ended in disaster for his army. This defeat considerably weakened his position and opened up new opportunities for the other powers. Prussia took advantage of this opportunity. It joined Napoleon's opponents and began the so-called War of Liberation. This phase was characterized by a new spirit, patriotic enthusiasm, the will to reform, and the desire for independence-determined action. The Battle of Leipzig in 1813, in which Prussia played a major role, was a decisive victory over Napoleon. In the following years, his power was further reduced until he was finally defeated in 1815. For Prussia, this meant a return to the European political stage. At the Congress of Vienna, which reorganized the order after the Napoleonic Wars, Prussia was able to strengthen its position and win new territories. It became one of the leading powers in the newly created German Confederation. But the experiences of the Napoleonic era had changed the country permanently. The reforms had laid the foundation for a more modern state, and the awareness of national identity had grown. At the same time, the tension between reform and tradition remained. Chapter 11 shows Prussia in one of its greatest crises, and at the same time in a phase of change and renewal. The defeats against Napoleon revealed the weaknesses of the old system, but they also led to reforms that strengthened the state in the long term. It is the story of a collapse that becomes a new beginning. From humiliation comes the will to change. From the crisis, the basis for future success. Prussia does not emerge from the Napoleonic Wars as an unchanged state, but as a country that has reinvented itself, ready for the challenges of the 19th century. Chapter 12: The Path to German Unity. After the end of the Napoleonic Wars and the Congress of Vienna in 1815, Prussia entered a new phase of its history. It had not only been strengthened territorially, but it also established itself politically as one of the leading powers in the newly created German Confederation. But this federation was not a nation-state, but a loose association of principalities, kingdoms, and free cities, shaped by different interests, traditions, and claims to power. At the center of this structure were two great powers, Prussia and Austria. A rivalry developed between them that was to decisively shape the further course of German history. The German Confederation was a compromise from the beginning. It was intended to ensure stability and prevent revolutionary movements, but it did not offer a clear perspective for the political unity of Germany. While many people longed for a nation-state, the princes clung to their sovereignty. Prussia also moved cautiously in this area of tension at first. On the one hand, it wanted to expand its influence, but on the other hand, it had to take into account the existing order. In the first decades after 1815, Prussia was mainly concerned with internal challenges. The reforms from the time of the Napoleonic Wars had initiated important changes, but many questions remained unanswered. How should the state be organized? What rights should citizens have? And how could economic progress be combined with political stability? An important step in this phase was economic integration. Prussia played a central role in the founding of the German Customs Union in 1834. This alliance created a common economic area without internal tariffs and promoted trade between the German states. The Zollverein was more than just an economic project. It also strengthened Prussia's political position, as it took the lead in this union. While economic cooperation progressed, however, political unity remained unachieved. Tensions between conservative forces and liberal movements increased. Especially in 1848, there was a wave of revolutions that swept across Europe. In the German states, too, many people demanded more codetermination, constitutions, and national unity. In Prussia, this movement led to a phase of political uncertainty. The king was forced to make concessions, and a national assembly convened to discuss a constitution for Germany. In Frankfurt's Paulskirche, the founding of a German nation-state was seriously discussed for the first time. But this attempt ultimately failed. The offered imperial crown was rejected by the Prussian king, as it came from the hand of the people and was not awarded by the princes. Thus, the revolution of 1848 ended without the hoped-for political unity. The old power structures remained, and the hopes of many people were dashed. Despite this setback, the revolution had long-term effects. It showed that the desire for unity and codetermination was deeply rooted in society. At the same time, it became clear that unification could not be achieved through revolutionary movements alone, but that political power and strategic action were required. In the following years, the rivalry between Prussia and Austria intensified. Both powers claimed the leading role in the German Confederation, but their interests were not compatible. Austria was a multi-ethnic state with different regions and cultures, while Prussia increasingly relied on a stronger national orientation. These differences led to political competition, which manifested itself in various conflicts. Prussia tried to expand its influence and take a leading role in Germany, while Austria defended its traditional position. This dispute was not only conducted at the diplomatic level, but also prepared the ground for later military conflicts. A decisive factor in this development was the change in political strategies. While earlier attempts at unification were often characterized by idealistic ideas, a realpolitik approach now prevailed. It was no longer just about ideas, but about power, interests, and concrete decisions. This development was to reach its climax in the second half of the 19th century, when a new political leadership in Prussia determined the course. Under the leadership of Otto von Bismarck, the question of German unity was no longer decided in parliaments or assemblies, but through targeted politics and, if necessary, military means. But before that happened, Prussia had already created important conditions. Its economic strength, administrative organization, and political experience made it a central player in Germany. At the same time, the failed revolution had shown that unification was only possible if it was supported by a strong power. Chapter 12, thus, shows a phase of transition. It is the time between the first ideas of German unity and their actual implementation. A time full of hopes, conflicts, and developments that paved the way for the coming chapter. In this phase, Prussia is on its way to becoming a leading power, not yet at its goal, but already decisively shaped by the experiences of the past decades. The question is no longer whether there will be German unity, but how and under whose leadership it is to come about. Chapter 12 ends with an open tension. The prerequisites have been created, the forces are in motion, and the decisive step is imminent. Chapter 13, Bismarck and the founding of the Reich. German unity, long a long-term goal and political ideal, entered a phase of practical implementation in the 19th century. Prussia, strengthened by reforms, economic boom, and an efficient administration, was now the power that could take on the leading role. At the center of this trial was a single figure, Otto von Bismarck, who later became the Iron Chancellor. Bismarck understood politics as a realistic strategic shaping of power, not as idealism. Under his leadership, Prussia became the engine of national unification and the driving force behind the founding of the German Empire in 1871. Bismarck took office as Prussian Prime Minister in 1862, in a phase marked by tensions between the monarchy, liberal movements, and other German states. Prussia had a strong army, a modern administration, and a growing industrial base, but the political unity of Germany had not yet been achieved. The German Confederation was still a loose association of individual states whose interests diverged greatly. The rivalry between Prussia and Austria had intensified, and the question of dominance in Germany was raised. Bismarck realized that unification could only be achieved through a combination of diplomacy, strategic warfare, and political calculation. His approach was consistently pragmatic. He relied on a blood and iron policy to strengthen Prussia's position and unite the German states under Prussian leadership. The first step in this process was the German-Danish War of 1864, when Schleswig and Holstein, two duchies with close cultural ties to Germany, were under Danish control. Prussia, together with Austria, intervened to secure the territories. The war was successful, and Schleswig was awarded to Prussia, while Holstein initially came under Austrian administration. This success demonstrated Prussia's military strength and set the first building block for further unification. The second decisive conflict was the Austro-Prussian War of 1866, also known as the Austro-Prussian War. Here it was no longer about individual territories, but about supremacy in Germany. Bismarck acted skillfully. He isolated Austria diplomatically, secured the neutrality of important states, and exploited his military superiority. Within a few weeks, Prussia led its forces to a decisive victory. Austria was excluded from the German Confederation, and Prussia instead founded the North German Confederation, a political entity under Prussian leadership. This success fundamentally shifted the balance of power in Germany. Prussia had taken on the leading role, the rival states were subordinate, and the basis for national unity had been laid. Nevertheless, the southern German states, which were traditionally more associated with Austria, were still missing. The decisive step followed in the Franco-German War of 1870 to 1871, when Bismarck used the diplomatic provocation of the so-called EMS dispatch to drive France into war under Napoleon III. This war was cleverly staged as a national conflict that brought the southern German states to the side of Prussia. Through joint military successes, battles such as Sedan or the Siege of Paris, the awareness of a common German identity and the need for unity grew. On January 18, 1871, in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, the German Empire was finally proclaimed. The Prussian king, Wilhelm I, was crowned German emperor, and Prussia was officially the leading power in a united Germany. Bismarck, as the architect of this process, made a decisive contribution to the achievement of unity under Prussian leadership without a dominant Austrian influence. The founding of the Reich was not only a political event, but also a symbolic act. It united the German states under a central leadership, created a clearly defined nation-state, and placed Prussia at the head of a new order in Central Europe. Prussia's military strength, efficient administration, and economic modernization had made this success possible. Bismarck's ability to combine diplomacy and military power made him the central actor of this era. But the founding of the empire also brought challenges. The federal structure of the empire retained a certain autonomy for the individual states, and tensions between Prussian dominance and regional interests remained. At the same time, the Reich had to be stabilized domestically. Economic modernization, social reforms, and the integration of the population into a common state were central tasks. Bismarck's domestic policy also showed his strategic thinking. With the Kulturkampf, he aimed to limit the influence of the Catholic Church and strengthen the central power of the empire. At the same time, he introduced social reforms, such as the introduction of health and accident insurance, in order to bind the population and alleviate social tensions. In doing so, he combined conservative state power with targeted reforms to ensure stability and loyalty. The success of the founding of the German Empire and the establishment of Prussia as the leading power permanently changed the political balance in Europe. Prussia, which once began as a province in the shadow of powerful states, had developed over centuries into a great power that dominated the German nation-state. Bismarck's strategic foresight, combined with military strength and political skill, made this change possible. Chapter 13 thus shows how Prussia under Bismarck went from being a regional center of power to the engine of German unity. It is the story of a targeted, consistent policy that combined diplomacy, war, and reform. The founding of the German Empire in 1871 marked not only the end of a long process of unification, but also the culmination of Prussia's rise, a phase that finally established Prussia as the dominant power in Germany and laid the foundation for the political landscape of the late 19th century. Chapter 14: Prussia in the Empire. With the founding of the German Empire in 1871, Prussia entered a new phase in its history. As the dominant power of the empire, Prussia shaped not only its politics, but also its identity and institutions. The empire was federally organized, but Prussia provided the emperor, controlled most of the Reichstag, and dominated the administration and the military. This position gave Prussia an influence that went far beyond its original borders, making it a key role in German politics. The political structure of the empire was complex. Formally, there was a federal system in which kingdoms, duchies, and free cities retained their own rights and institutions. But the reality was different. Prussia provided about 2/3 of the Reich's area and almost half of the population. It had the most deputies in the Bundesrat and was able to significantly influence decisions through its economic and military strength. This dominance made Prussia the leading power in the new German Empire. A central pillar of this power was the military. Even under the Hohenzollerns, the Prussian army had been a symbol of discipline, efficiency, and order. In the German Empire, it retained its outstanding importance. The military shaped not only Prussia's defense capability, but also its social self-image. Officers came mainly from the nobility, especially the Junkers, who owned land and had influence. This connection between the military, the nobility, and the state formed the backbone of Prussian identity. The Prussian administration was another pillar of power. It was hierarchically organized, efficient, and centralized. Civil servants were selected on merit, decision-making processes were clearly structured, and corruption was largely prevented. This administration ensured that Prussia was considered a model state within the empire. It was both an instrument of power and a guarantor of stability and order. Socially, Prussia was characterized by tradition and hierarchy. The nobility, especially the Junkers, held privileged positions in the administration and military. Farmers increasingly had personal rights, but in many regions they remained tied to land ownership and taxes. Cities and industry developed, but social tensions remained. Prussia thus combined modernization and conservative structures, which proved to be characteristic of the state. Economic development was closely linked to industrialization. Prussia benefited from its natural resources, especially coal and iron, as well as from its location in Central Europe. Cities such as Berlin, the Ruhr area, and Saxony became centers of industry, trade, and innovation. Infrastructure, railways, canals, roads, has been expanded to support the growing economy. At the same time, the population grew and new social groups emerged: workers, entrepreneurs, and urban middle classes. Politically, Prussia played a leading role in shaping the laws of the empire. The Prussian prime minister was often also chancellor of the Reich, which allowed Prussia to assert its interests directly at the national level. This position made it possible to use the federal structure of the empire in favor of Prussia and to strengthen the country's influence on the politics of other states. Culture and education were other areas in which Prussia claimed to be a role model. Universities, research institutions, and cultural institutions were supported. Berlin developed into a center of science, art, and philosophy. Prussia's cultural achievement contributed to the legitimation of political and military dominance and consolidated national self-confidence. But this supremacy also brought tensions. Other German states viewed Prussia's dominance with skepticism or rejection. Bavaria, Württemberg, and other kingdoms had their own interests and strove for autonomy. These regional differences repeatedly led to conflicts within the empire, which had to be resolved through diplomacy, compromise, and sometimes pressure. Prussia's role in the German Empire was therefore ambivalent. It was a leading power and engine of unity, but at the same time a source of tension and conflict. This ambivalence shaped the politics, society, and identity of the country. Prussia was able to modernize and lead, but it also had to react to resistance and defend its dominance again and again. In the late 19th century, the political landscape also began to change. New political movements emerged, especially socialist and liberal groups, demanding more participation, social reforms, and rights for working people. Prussia reacted to this with a mixture of repression, social welfare, and political calculation. The state tried to maintain stability without endangering its power base. The Prussian identity in the empire was based on three pillars: military strength, administrative efficiency, and cultural self-assurance. This combination made Prussia the dominant force within Germany, shaped the state, and influenced political culture far beyond its own borders. Chapter 14 thus shows how Prussia consolidated its position in the empire. It is the story of a state that used its power strategically, modernized its institutions, and at the same time preserved its traditions. Prussia was the engine, stability factor, and role model, and thus decisive for the political, economic, and cultural development of Germany in the late 19th century. If you want, I can write Chapter 15 directly to cover the conclusion of Prussian history up to the dissolution in 1947. Do you want me to do this now? Chapter 15: The End of Prussia. The history of Prussia does not end abruptly, but is the result of a long process of transformations, political decisions, and external events that finally sealed the end of this once powerful state. From the duchy to the kingdom to the dominant power in the German Empire, Prussia had experienced centuries of expansion, reform, and modernization. But the developments of the 20th century presented the state with challenges that put its structures and identity to the test. After the First World War 1914 to 1918, the German Empire was defeated, and with it the hegemony of the Prussian royal family within the framework of the imperial order. The abdication of Kaiser Wilhelm II in November 1918 led to the proclamation of the Weimar Republic. Prussia, which had been considered the dominant power of the Reich until then, was politically disempowered. The king and his government lost their authority, and the state structures were integrated into the new republican system. Nevertheless, Prussia formally remained as a state, now under democratic administration. For Prussia, the Weimar period was marked by tensions between tradition and modernity. On the one hand, the Republic tried to introduce democratic institutions and implement social reforms, but on the other hand, the conservative structures, especially the nobility and parts of the bureaucracy, remained influential. Although Prussia was formally a federal state within the Republic, its political culture was still strongly influenced by Prussian traditions. Order, discipline, and hierarchy remained deeply rooted. Politically, Prussia became a central arena of tensions within the Weimar Republic during this time. The state elections and the composition of the government showed the tensions between left and right forces that destabilized the country. Prussia tried to push through reforms, but was repeatedly restricted by the Reich. This dynamic made it clear that the old Prussian structures were resilient, but no longer fully compatible with modern democratic requirements. With the rise of the National Socialists in 1933, the situation changed fundamentally. The Prussian government, once regarded as a bulwark against radical forces, was deliberately eliminated. The so-called Prussian strike law and the enforced conformity of the states severely curtailed Prussia's political autonomy. The country was de facto incorporated into the centralized system of the National Socialist dictatorship. The administration, which had once been a symbol of Prussian efficiency, was now brought into line, and the characteristic structures of the state lost their independence. During the Second World War, Prussia no longer played an independent role. The country was administratively divided and placed completely under the control of the Reich. Military decisions were made centrally by the Führer and his advisors, and Prussia's historical identity was increasingly reduced to a symbolic level. The old Prussian traditions, discipline, bureaucracy, military prestige, were instrumentalized by the ideology of the National Socialists, but the institutions of the state itself no longer existed as an independent political power. After 1945, with the end of the Second World War, the final destruction of Prussia began. The Allies saw Prussia as a state that had historically stood for militarism, expansionism, and centralist power politics. In the Potsdam Conference and the subsequent decisions of the Allied powers, the dissolution of Prussia was decided. The state was formally abolished, its territories distributed to the new occupation zones, and the country's institutions were dissolved. Prussia thus ceased to exist after more than 700 years of history. The division of territory was profound. Historic Prussia, which stretched across present-day Germany, Poland, Lithuania, and parts of Russia, was smashed. The core area was integrated into several new states within the Federal Republic of Germany: Brandenburg, Mecklenburg-Western Pomerania, North Rhine-Westphalia, Schleswig-Holstein, and others. East Prussia, the heart of the former kingdom, was divided between the Soviet Union and Poland. Cities that were once a symbol of Prussian power, such as Königsberg, now Kaliningrad, disappeared from German administration and were given new national affiliations. Despite the dissolution, Prussia's cultural heritage continued to exist. Administrative traditions, military discipline, education systems, and cultural values left traces that had an impact for a long time. Many principles that had shaped Prussia, efficiency, order, a sense of duty, were adopted in the new federal states and in the German administration. Historians emphasize that Prussia did not simply disappear. Rather, his legacy was transformed into modern state and social structures that shaped post-war Germany. The debate about the dissolution of Prussia was, and still is, controversial today. Critics argue that the dismantling was not only a punishment, but also a loss of historical continuity. Proponents, on the other hand, saw it as a necessary measure to eliminate the causes of militarism and expansionism for which Prussia historically stood. Historically, the Allies' decision was consistent in the context of the post-war order. A strong centralist state with military prestige should no longer have a chance to pursue expansive policies again. Another aspect of the end of Prussia was the uprooting of the population in the eastern territories. Millions of people were displaced, lost their homes, and had to integrate into new regions. This experience shapes the memory of Prussia in Poland, Germany, and Russia to this day. Historic towns, castles, and administrative centers that were symbols of Prussian rule were given new names and new national affiliations. This meant that not only a political, but also a cultural identity was lost. Despite everything, the myth of Prussia lives on. In literature, art, politics, and historiography, Prussia is often portrayed as a symbol of discipline, efficiency, military strength, and political order. This perception not only influenced German history in the 20th century, but also shaped the self-perception of the nation and administration. Prussia formally disappeared, but its influence on state organization, military affairs, and social norms remained noticeable. Chapter 15 thus summarizes the end of Prussia. A state that had grown, shaped, and dominated over centuries was shattered by war, political decisions, and international order. Its dissolution in 1947 marked the end of a historical entity whose influence, however, extended far beyond its formal existence. Prussia, from the duchy to the dominant power in the empire, left behind a legacy that remained deeply rooted in German administration, culture, and history. It is the story of a state that emerged from weakness, rose to become a European power factor and was finally dissolved in the reorganization after 2 world wars. A complex cycle of rise, power, reforms, conflicts, and final transformation. Prussia no longer exists as a political entity today, but its historical and cultural legacy continues to shape Germany and Europe to the present day.